Welcome to Conversations. A couple of weeks back, Andy and Lau and I were talking, and I started talking about a gentleman that I'd met at a party, and we talked about Methodism, and I decided maybe I should have the gentleman on instead of talking about what he said to me. And that gentleman is Mr. Bryan Spellman. Bryan is the Executive Officer for the School of Fine Arts?
Administrative Officer, Greg.
Administrative Officer of the School of Fine Arts. He's also active in doing things for the gay cause here in Missoula. He's a member of the Methodist Church, and Methodism is our jumping off point. Do you want to tell us about the recent conference that the Methodists had?
Well, and what a jumping off point. And I should say, Greg, that I am a former Methodist. You know, the Jesuits, I believe, say that give me a child to the age of 12 and he's mine for life, and if I never go through the doors of another Methodist church, I will be a Methodist till I die, but my name's not on the rolls any longer.
Ah, you're rather angry with the Methodists.
Well, I'm a little upset, yes.
Disappointed.
Disappointed, not terribly surprised, but what I see happening goes against everything that I know to be Wesleyan tradition, and that's very upsetting.
I'm going to ask you about your view of the Wesleyan tradition before we go on to what just happened.
Okay.
You see John Wesley as instituting what sort of a church?
Well, understand, of course, that John Wesley never left the Church of England. And he was an ordained priest in the Church of England, and he lived and died an ordained priest in the Church of England. He was, however, at one point locked out of his own church. He served at church, I believe it was Epworth Church in England, and because of his work with what we would today call street people, the pillars of the church locked the church doors. He went out and stood on his father's gravestone. His father was also an Anglican priest, and said, "The world is my parish." Wesley taught a very strict way of doing things, a very methodical way of doing things, and his detractors said, "Well, you're nothing but a bunch of Methodists." And he said, "Well, that's the name we'll take." But it was also a very non-dogmatic practice. And to this day, there is no dogma, per se, in the Methodist Church. There have been a couple trials, interesting trials, that have happened in the United Methodist Church here in the United States in the past few years that have been thrown out of the Judicial Council because they would be based on a church that has dogma, and the Methodist Church doesn't, so the Judicial Council says you can't have heresy if you don't have dogma.
Brian, before you go on, so then when did the Methodist churches separate, become a separate thing from the Church of England?
Well, that's a difficult question. In England, it happened quite differently than it did in America. The precursor of what is today called the United Methodist Church and several other churches in the Methodist or Wesleyan tradition in the United States was founded in Baltimore in 1784. And the way that happened was that with the American Revolution, the Church of England stopped sending priests to what had been the colonies. Yeah. Wesley was very concerned about this because while he had been setting up Methodist societies, these were basically Sunday schools, and the people attending these Methodist societies were instructed to go to their local Anglican church for the sacraments. All of a sudden, there were no Anglican churches for them to go to. So Wesley called a couple of his friends and supporters, Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke, and sent them to America to preach the gospel and to do what was necessary to maintain the order of the church. At that point, his brother Charles, who most people know as an extremely prolific hymn writer, said, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Because in essence, what he had done was he had broken apostolic succession and sent two men off to act as bishops without having the Church of England having consecrated them as bishops.
So de facto he'd created a new church.
De facto, exactly.
Yeah.
And Francis Asbury certainly took that role to heart and got to America and became, for all intents and purposes, a Methodist pope, if you will.
In America.
In America.
So the church now is international.
Oh, yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
That happened after the Revolution at some point,
Yes.
didn't it? What stand did the Methodists take on slavery? Or did they?
Well, again, let's go back to your first question,
All right.
because it bears on this. Wesley said he didn't care what you believed. If you want to worship God, come and sit with me, and we will worship God. I don't care what form of worship you feel you need, come and we will worship together. What that has meant over the past 200 years, 200 plus years, is that today the United Methodist Church encompasses, say, Cecil Williams at Glad Memorial Church in San Francisco on the one side, and the Reverend Donald Wildman of the American Family Council on the other side. They are both ordained United Methodist ministers in good standing. At the time of, say, the mid-19th century, the Methodist Church, which at that time was called the Methodist Episcopal Church, was facing, as was all of American society, the very real question of slavery, and also, dare I say, states' rights, if you can look at that in an ecclesiastical standpoint. The church took the position that no officers of the church should own slaves.
No, that's
Now,
nice of them, yeah.
but they didn't speak out strongly against slavery. And at that time, you have to understand, the Methodist Episcopal Church was probably the closest thing that we had in this country to a national church. It was strong in all sections of the country, as opposed to other denominations which were more regional. One particular bishop, well, he owned no slaves himself. He was married to a woman who inherited slaves. And the question was raised at General Conference. That's the group that comes together every 4 years to govern the church. What do we do about this bishop who, in effect, owned slaves through marriage? Because of that question, the church split. And it split eventually into three main bodies: the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which today we know mainly through Southern Methodist University, and the Methodist Protestant Church, which decided to get rid of bishops altogether. That split lasted from, I believe, 1844 till 1939, when those three branches of Methodism came back together. At the same time, there were other branches that split off because they were predominantly black churches that felt they were not getting the support they needed from the denomination as a whole. And so from that, we have today the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and what's now called the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, but used to be called in pre-PC days the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. As I say, in 1939, the white churches came back together. The black churches are still involved in dialogue, but have not come back into union with us.
That may be more about Methodism than I really care to know.
I'm sure it was, Greg, and I'm sure it's more than your viewers
bear
want.
upon, a lot of people are saying that gay rights, the place of gay people within the church, is the biggest issue since slavery. So there is a tie in here. We want to talk about this conference that the Methodists just finished and what happened.
Well, as I mentioned, every 4 years the church comes together as an international body to rewrite or to revisit the rules by which the church is governed. And those rules are codified in a book called the Book of Discipline. Every quadrennium since 1972, it would seem as though the main issue of discussion has been the question of homosexuality. In the 1972 discipline, a phrase was inserted in the social principles of the discipline that says, and I might not have this exact, but it's pretty much, homosexuals, no less than heterosexuals, are children of God and should have their full civil and legal rights upheld. That phrase lasted for 4 years. At the next quadrennium, the conservatives said, wait a minute. We can't say things like that unless we qualify it. So a phrase was added that said, however, we consider the practice of homosexuality incompatible with Christian teaching. Those two phrases have been glued together ever since in the Book of Discipline. And it would seem that every quadrennium something happens that makes the process a little more restrictive, or the rules a little more restrictive. By the time we got to the 1996 General Conference, several things had happened. The church is not allowed, under the rules in the discipline, to fund anything that might be seen as promoting homosexuality. Openly gay people are not allowed to be ordained within the church. And in 1996, the new part that was added forbade Methodist ministers to participate in union ceremonies for same-sex couples, or I believe also forbade the use of Methodist church property for such unions. But definitely the ministers were enjoined to keep away from such proceedings. Because of the position in the discipline, in the social principles section, there have been ministers who said, this is not church law, it's only a recommendation. And several ministers have actually performed holy unions, Jimmy Creech being the most famous.
Well, didn't the Methodists recently have a big to-do in California where a group of ministers participated as an act of provocation, if nothing else?
That's the reason why I brought up the question of states' rights with slavery. The Methodist Church is what is called a connectional church. That is to say, the discipline holds all of us together, whether we are in Missoula, Montana, San Francisco, California, or Sierra Leone. It doesn't matter. What happened in California was Don Fado, who was pastor at one of the large churches in Sacramento, and 60-some other ministers performed a holy union for two lesbians.
It's a bit of overkill, but...
Well, you have to understand, Don had proposed this. He said, because of what had happened with Jimmy Creech, who was a pastor in Nebraska, who was, in terms outside the Methodist Church, you'd say he was defrocked because of performing a holy union for a gay couple. Because of what had happened with Jimmy Creech, Don Fado said, I will engage in an act of ecclesiastical disobedience if there is a couple who wishes for me to do this. Well, it turned out that one of the women in his church, who also, if I remember right, is the top layperson in the California-Nevada Conference, stepped forward and said, I'm a lesbian, I would love to be married to my partner. So Don said, I will perform the wedding. And 67 other ministers said, as an act of ecclesiastical disobedience, we will join with you.
Uh-huh.
And so that's what happened. Now, there's a movement within the United Methodist Church called the Reconciling Movement, which is designed to bring full inclusion of gay and lesbian, transgendered people into the fellowship of the United Methodist Church.
Bryan, I might add that for our viewers, the different denominations call these by different names. Congregationalists, it's open and affirming.
I think the Lutherans call it reconciled in Christ.
Yeah, and the only connection they have I shouldn't say that, but they work through a magazine called Open Hands, where the new churches who have decided they will be open are reported on, and the score is kept. So your group, it's reconciling?
The Reconciling Congregation program. And it's quite a strong program nationwide. It is so strong that in California, Northern California Nevada Conference has become a reconciling conference, much to the chagrin of the conservatives in California. But the case went, I'm not sure how far into the judicial process it actually went, but it was eventually thrown out because the discipline is viewed as being self-contradictory, much as, dare I say, the Bible is often self-contradictory. And the viewpoint presented to Bishop Talbert of the California-Nevada Conference was, this conference is reconciling, therefore the conference is inclusive. That takes precedent over any statement that says we have to be exclusive, because the church is viewed as an inclusive church, and has been from Wesley's day on. The bishop said, fine, I accept that finding, and dropped all the charges. That caused quite an uproar. And in fact, the very first item brought before General Conference this year was, does the discipline actually bind us together, or do individual conferences have the right to say, no, we're not going to pay attention to this or that? So we're right back to the states' rights issue, if you will.
Interesting. So the conference decided?
Well, the General Conference decided, in that issue, I think they pretty much decided not to decide. It was amazing. The vote was almost 50-50 on that.
I saw a lot of protesters on television, and
Mel White's organization Soul Force showed up to have nonviolent protests at General Conference, as they will be doing with the Episcopalians in Denver and the Presbyterians in Los Angeles or Southern California later on this year. With them they had Martin Luther King's daughter and Gandhi's grandson, both of whom were arrested in protests in Cleveland. Two of our bishops were arrested in these protests, saying that the position of the church is wrong. The church needs to be inclusive.
and you're angry with the church, or so you're not going to the church locally?
No.
And would you care to explain why?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that historically, there are two Methodist congregations, United Methodist congregations in Missoula. First Church downtown here and Grace out on 10th and Garfield. Both churches have exhibited a certain amount of homophobia in the past. There is a movement within First Church at this point to become a reconciling congregation. But also at this point, there is not a single reconciling congregation in the Yellowstone Conference. That's Montana and northern Wyoming.
Oh, wow.
There are a couple of churches have tried. Bozeman First Church has started the process, I believe, and I was part of a process up at St. Ignatius years and years ago to begin to at least study the issue. But I think the pastor who was there at the time left, and I'm not sure that his predecessor carried on with the process.
Well, the downtown church opened up for the Matthew Shepard Memorial, and that indicates a certain level of caring of some sort.
And as I say, there is a movement within First Church now to become a reconciling congregation. Nonetheless, my anger is more at the institutional church. I was raised in the Methodist Church. My father was a Methodist minister, then a United Methodist minister. I've put a lot of time and energy into the church. When you join the Methodist Church, you take 4 vows. You vow to support the church with your prayers, your presence, your gifts, and your service. To me, it seems that were I to do that at this point, I would be engaging in an act of homophobia, because I would be working to preserve a structure that institutionally says I'm not welcome.
So your argument is with the big church?
My argument is with the church universal, if I can put it that way, for the United Methodist Church, yes.
Have you considered that you might do better staying within the structure and working for acceptance? Of course you've considered that.
I considered that, and I've had many gay people say exactly that. But, you know, as I say, this has been an issue in the United Methodist Church since 1972.
Yeah.
After a while, you have to ask yourself, how much longer am I going to keep beating my head against this brick wall? And it's only been in the last 2 months that I have severed my connections with the United Methodist Church. So I felt I was working within.
Well, I've talked a lot on this show about the fact that I really think that churches have a role to play in the emerging gay consciousness, and I think that's something underscored by what you're talking about.
Greg, I've said for many, many years, traditional societies have always recognized gay people as being intercessors, people who had a special view of humanity. And more often than not, gay people have served as the priests, the shamans, whatever, for their own tribe or society. I firmly believe that one of the biggest problems that faces the gay community in America, and certainly for me, the root cause of the alcoholism and drug abuse problems within the gay community, is that our society does not allow us to take our rightful place. It does not recognize us in our rightful place. And if we are serving in that kind of a capacity, more often than not, we are doing it hiding and living a lie. That's not healthy at all.
I'm not sure every gay person should be a priest or an intercessor.
I'm not saying that every gay person should be, but I do think that gay people do have a very special insight into the human condition that we're not allowed to develop.
This is an argument Andy and I have all the time, because I think gay people are just the same as everybody else, and the idea that they're special in any way can only come because of what they've gone through, and he argues that gay people just by their nature are special. And we go round and round. It sounds like you're on Andy's side on that one.
Well, I probably am. I guess my question to you is, why are there gay people if we don't have a role to play?
Oh, I think the reasons for being gay are so varied that I'm not sure that there is an identity in that sense.
Well, and I suppose that's something that we'd have to agree to disagree on.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, please understand, it's the same thing as the special rights issue. I'm not saying that there's anything intrinsically better about gay people. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that, yes, I think we have a unique insight that straight people just don't have.
Well, I think we'd probably agree on the outcome. I think gay people, because of their situation, often are in a certain situation and develop certain characteristics. I just won't go as far as saying that that's the way they are by nature. I don't like that. I'm a little too strong on free will for that. I would like to, well, we have you here to talk about Richard.
Feel free.
In a sense, if anyone thinks it's a private issue, and maybe I shouldn't bring it up, it was not private at the time.
Oh, it was very private at the time.
When I came back from California, I didn't know anyone. I'd been away so long, I knew a few people, and I was told, well, I should get in touch with Bryan Spellman. I didn't know Bryan Spellman, but I guess you were sort of the unofficial welcome wagon, and we got invited to your place for dinner. Had a very nice dinner, met a gentleman named Richard, vibrant, intelligent, fun to be around, who was one of the first people to be HIV positive and who later died of the disease, and was first in the state or first in the community?
Richard was the first person in Missoula County to be diagnosed with AIDS. That was in June of 1986. Now, there had been a couple of cases diagnosed around the state, I think in Great Falls and Billings, but Richard was the first case in Missoula County, the first diagnosed case. I don't want to say he was the first case, but he was the first official diagnosed case in Missoula County.
I had it in my bloodstream at that time, I'm sure, but...
Oh, I'm sure that many people did.
Yeah.
And there were people who were sick in Missoula, but they had not been diagnosed in Missoula.
His death became public. Would you like to tell us how that happened and the ins and outs? Because part of it was your doing and part of it was not your doing.
You're not going to let me get away from Methodism.
Right.
It's part of the social gospel. And when I came out, I came out in 1977, I realized that I couldn't be silent. There were people who were out there who were committing suicide for no better reason than they were gay. And that's not a good reason to commit suicide. So I took a vow then that I would yell from the rooftops if I had to make people understand that there was no reason for vibrant, healthy young people to kill themselves just because they were gay. When Richard became sick, I became very frustrated because, in the first place, as I say, he was the first case diagnosed with AIDS in Missoula County. So there was no support structure at all in this community. There was nothing like the AIDS task force. There was no AIDS council. There was nothing. In fact, our own doctors suggested that we move to Seattle. My predilection would have been to go very public. Richard's predilection was to stay extremely private. I had to respect that. He was the one who was sick. It became very frustrating for me because, as I'm sure you're aware by now, I like to talk. And Richard wouldn't allow me to talk. I couldn't talk to anyone outside the walls of our home, and he wouldn't talk to me himself. And he would go see his doctor. He would not let me go with him, and I had no idea what was going on with him. We did make a trip out to Seattle. We went to Harborview, and we spent a full day out there, and they did a full range of tests and called the two of us in and spoke to us as a couple, which I think was right, afterwards. And the words that the doctor used in talking to us, I will never forget. He said, "I have known a great many men who have this disease and have lived a long time. You won't be one of them." And indeed, Richard lasted 13 months from diagnosis till when he died. He died on Tuesday, the 21st of July, 1987. Did I say he was diagnosed in 87? He was diagnosed in 86. He died in 87. I was told at the time, if you don't want the Missoulian to write his obituary, you'd better write it yourself. So I did. I wrote his obituary. And in the obituary, I mentioned that he was survived by his lover, and mentioned myself.
Not a long-term companion.
No, the Missoulian couldn't deal with that. But they didn't call me. They called Ellen Leahy. And they said...
Was she head of the health department then? Or?
She wasn't head, but she was working in the health department at that time, and she was a personal friend of Richard's and mine. And they said, we have this obituary for Richard Donovan, and it says that he died of AIDS, and what do you think? And Ellen said, I don't think you should run it until you've talked to Bryan. And they said, Bryan brought it in. She said, in that case, run it.
Yeah, I would think so.
In that case, run it. But the Missoulian could not deal with the word lover. And they said, and I suppose in retrospect they were right, that most people would not understand what I meant by that word. Frankly, I could care less what most people think, but we argued back and forth, and I threatened to call the Shermers and everything else trying to get my point across, and eventually we did compromise. But in the compromise, the Missoulian asked if they could send a reporter out to interview me, because it was, after all, front page news, and AIDS was becoming more and more important in Montana, and of course across the country. So I agreed to that, and Thursday, couldn't have been Thursday, the article appeared Thursday. In any event, the Missoulian sent Teresa Johnson to interview me. Bless her heart. I don't think she knew what she was getting into. Teresa spent 2 hours at my kitchen table talking about what the previous 13 months had been like, and then had to edit that down for a front page article in the Missoulian. That article was printed in every daily newspaper in the state of Montana. It went out on the wire services because we mentioned Richard's doctor, who was originally from Salt Lake City. It was sent to Salt Lake City. Because Richard was born and grew up in San Francisco, it went to San Francisco. I started getting calls, letters, postcards. I thought the house would be bombed. I really did. I mean, that was the tenor of the times. But the community we live in is, to me, so special. And this is my home, and had nothing but good feelings coming to me. And I had people from all over Montana calling me. I even had a woman from Phoenix, Arizona send me a letter. An elderly woman who lives down the street with whom I'd exchanged maybe 3 words in the 10 years that I'd been living there called me up to tell me that she'd just lost her sister to cancer, and she knew what I was going through, and she felt for me and wanted me to know that. It was an incredible outpouring of support, and I will be forever grateful for that.
That's any negative?
Not to me. One person called my boss at the university and said, the university shouldn't be hiring people like that. And my boss at the time was Jim Criley. He said, you don't know what you're talking about. 2 people called the president of the university. Said, the university should fire him. They shouldn't have people like that at the university. And the president said, you don't know what you're talking about.
It's remarkable. We live in a remarkable community.
We do indeed, Greg.
I preach all the time to people that who are afraid that it isn't that bad out there, that we have a lot of tolerant, open, straight people who are wonderful in times of crisis and who really help out. If we can switch to the university, your job will be ending there soon? Or?
I have requested a year's leave of absence. I requested it starting July 15th. It looks like it will happen starting September 1st. But yes.
And
I've been there 22 years. I'm tired.
Good Lord.
And the bureaucracy is just getting worse and worse. But don't get me started on the university.
I don't plan to. Do you have plans for that?
Oh, yes. Yes. 3 things. As do most people on campus that I'm aware of, I have, if you will, a second job. In my case, I have a home-based business, and I'm going to work like anything to build that thing up to the point where it's doing quite well. And it's actually helping people. It's not filling out pieces of paper. That's what I do at the university. I also plan on traveling. I love to travel, and right now, We have a trip to Turkey planned. We're going to spend 3 weeks in Turkey in October. I'm also going to spend some time with my mother in California. Plan to spend some time in France. It's been 6 years since I've been back to France, and with a PhD in French, that's not good, you know, and maybe some time on the beaches in Mexico. But the main thing that I want to do is I believe very firmly in vocation, and this is also part of my anger with the Methodist Church. If God has called you to ministry, who is the Methodist Church to tell you that you can't practice it? I believe very firmly in vocation. I also believe very firmly that my vocation is not to shuffle papers at the University of Montana. But I've been doing it for 22 years.
I was going to say,
I fell into it. I'm very good at it. I'm sick and tired of it. I've never felt at home doing that. I plan on really studying, meditating, praying, asking for guidance to find out what is my vocation. I'm 50 years old. It's time that I should know what my vocation is, don't you think?
I might say if you don't know by now, you'll never get there. But that'd be
You're never too late.
That'd be too unkind.
Never
Bryan.
too late to start.
Bryan, I'd love you to have you come back. There's many other things that we could talk about, but thank you very much for coming today.
Well, thank you, Greg.
Appreciate that.
Thank you.